Good evening and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. We are very pleased to have you with us this evening. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Ford Library and Museum and our parent organization, the National Archives and Records Administration, with essential support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. Those of you who are members of Friends of Ford, we thank you for your support because that is what makes possible these programs. Tonight, as usual, we're being filmed by the University of Michigan's Michigan Media. So when we get to the question and answer period at the end of the talk, we would appreciate it if you would go to the microphone at the back of the center aisle so that everyone who watches this later on cable television can hear your questions. And finally, the usual bit of housekeeping, would you please make sure that your telephones are turned to silent or are turned off. Tonight we have with us Leah Wright Rigueur, who is no stranger to the Ford Library. This is kind of a welcome back. She was with us in 2007 after being awarded a Ford Presidential Foundation Research Travel Grant. This research supported her dissertation, which was titled The Loneliness of the Black Conservative, Black Republicans and the Grand Old Party, 1936 to 1980. In 2015, the Princeton University Press released her book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. Much of the research for this book came from our archives here at the Ford Library, including a chapter devoted to President Ford, the presidency, Black Republicans, and African American voters. Leah Wright Rigueur is an assistant professor of public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. She is an historian by training with degrees from Dartmouth College and from Princeton University. Before joining the Kennedy School faculty, she was a professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Her research interests include 20th century United States political and social history and modern African American history. Her work and her coursework and her teaching emphasize race, civil rights movements, political ideology, the American two-party system, and the presidency. Her writing and research and commentary have been featured in a number of media outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as many of the national networks. Currently, her writing projects are several, including a piece on Black women and the Republican Party, an article on Black celebrities and modern conservatism. She's also working on a book manuscript on African American appointees in the Reagan and Bush administrations with a focus on economic justice and social welfare policies. Today in Ann Arbor, we have kept her very, very busy as while we issued the initial invitation, the Ford School of Public Policy ended up doing a major symposium on civil rights leadership today, and they asked if they could piggyback and invite Professor Rigueur to speak there this morning. And yes, she was willing. So she's had a busy day in Ann Arbor. This morning she spoke on the topic, Transforming the Party, the Enduring Significance of Jesse Jackson for President, because he was a keynoter later in the day. So we really hope that we have not worn her out completely, and we are saving the very best for last here at the Ford Library tonight. Please welcome back Leah Wright Rigueur.
Thank you so much. What a nice... Wow, what a really wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Elaine. I am delighted to be here today. Let me go backwards. I just wanted to thank you very quickly. Thank everyone first for coming out. It is amazing to see so many faces, particularly in what I know is the middle of the week, but also within the midst of a very, I think, pretty shocking last week and a half of American politics, or perhaps that's why you're here. I am delighted to be here, and I do want to thank everyone, particularly Elaine, but also the staff at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library for inviting me here today. I especially want to thank Kate, who has gone really above and beyond. Where's she working? Oh, she's in the booth. Who has gone really above and beyond, and first approached me about this idea a few months ago, actually quite some time ago. And I'm so happy to be back here. It feels like I've come really full circle. Just a quick detour, if you'll indulge me for a second. When I first came here, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And I probably shouldn't say that because I had a fellowship and I was supposed to sound like I knew what I was doing. The archives here are fantastic. I know I may be preaching to the choir, but they really did transform my research in ways that sometimes I have a hard time articulating. But to give you one example, when you take your dissertation and you change it into a book, it's one of the hardest processes you have to go through after, when you're in the writing stage. The material that I had from the Ford Library not only allowed me to completely reshape my argument, I had enough material that I probably could have written a book, a standalone book, just on the documents that I got from here. And in fact, the first draft of the piece that I'm about to share with you, when it was finished, was about 112 pages long. So I really wanted to say, I can't emphasize enough just how valuable the experience was to be here, to be in Ann Arbor, and how much it really shaped the book that I eventually put out. I also wanted to just let you guys know that I think it's a particularly interesting time to be a historian, particularly a historian who works on issues of race and politics, as you can all imagine. Now, in particular, and I don't want to stray too much into this, at least for the framework of the talk that I'm about to give, but I'm happy to talk about this during the Q&A. I think in particular, the parallels between the politics of today and the past are striking, but perhaps not in the way that we imagine them to be. And one of the things I do want us to think about throughout the lecture as I deliver this lecture is to think about possibility and to think about potential, right? And so what would an alternative path look like? And what would actual measurable reform look like within a democratic two-party system? Now, with that in mind, I'd like to just start us off with a really short story. It's about Gerald Ford's White House. When President Ford announced his nomination for Secretary of Transportation in January of 1975, no one, and I mean no one, was prepared to hear William T. Coleman's name. Though black leaders and political elites had bandied about his resume for years, they could not have predicted that a Republican president would appoint a black man to a cabinet position. The all-black National Newspaper Publishers Association congratulated Ford for his, quote, tangible demonstration of equality, a step, the group argued, that illustrated the new president's commitment to appointing African Americans to influential decision-making roles. Expressing more cautious praise in the pages of the Chicago Defender, Lewis Martin, the very famous black Democratic strategist, wrote, "I share the hopes of most black Americans, regardless of party, that President Ford's nomination of Coleman to his cabinet will mark a turning point in the traditional Republican attitude toward us." Now keep in mind, this is a partisan person making this statement. But the Coleman appointment is an excellent beginning. Now I'll come back to the Coleman story in a few minutes, but the question I want us to consider here, right, the question of the first layer of the Coleman appointment, is to really think about the shock or the surprise that emerged around this moment. The shock of an African American engaging a political party that had at the time a reputation for turning its back on the black vote and black interest. What's more, though Coleman's appointment was a startling moment, such interactions with the GOP were not actually isolated events. Throughout the modern post-war period, African Americans regularly worked with and within the Republican Party to influence the direction of the GOP. For example, Ralph Abernathy, who once described himself as the man in whose arms Martin Luther King Jr. died, offered a surprise engagement of Ronald Reagan in October 1980. Now, while singularly fascinating, these events are part of a much larger history, one in which African Americans sought new approaches to political independence and influence. They engaged the Republican Party for many complicated reasons, which I'm happy to discuss much more in depth during the Q&A. But at its core, these were pragmatic and strategic decisions. They believed that engaging the Republican Party was the most efficient and practical way to achieve full equality and measurable results within a two-party political system. Now, indeed, even the Reverend Jesse Jackson would employ this politically pragmatic rationale as a means of justifying engagement with the Republican Party. In a mid-1970s speech to the Republican National Committee, Jackson argued that black voters, quote, without cynicism but with realism, needed to exercise every political option in order to gain power and leverage in the larger struggle for racial equality, equity, and parity. The only protection we have against political genocide, he once explained, is to remain necessary. Now, he sounded almost identical to Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke, a black Republican, also shortlisted for Gerald Ford's vice presidential running mate in 1976, who in 1975 had told an audience of African Americans that large black constituencies could mean substantial black influence if applied strategically to both political parties. This strategy, Brooke reasoned, would allow African Americans to institute major social and economic changes from within both political parties. Now, part of what makes this opening account so counterintuitive, although perhaps not to this group who is, we're right here in the Ford Library, is our general notions of black Republicans and the GOP. Our perceptions rest on two very basic truths. First, African Americans, black voters, are the most partisan of any racial group within the United States. Since 1948, a substantial majority of African Americans have identified as Democrats. Since 1964, that lopsided figure has only increased as more than 80% of black voters have cast their ballots for the Democratic Party nominee in every presidential election. By 1980, more than 90% of the nation's 5,000 black elected officials were Democrats, including all of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. In 2012, African Americans played a crucial role in helping re-elect Barack Obama to the White House, offering the president roughly 94% of their votes. And in 2016, 88% of black voters cast ballots for Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. Her opponent, Donald Trump, earned a mere 8% of the black vote. Now, this partisanship was never blind or random, but was actually based on a realistic assessment of which party would best further black political and economic needs. I just want to show you a quick slide here. You can take a look. This is black partisan identification in presidential election years, 1936 to 2008. Just a little bit of an addendum. As of 2016, that number in terms of Republican Party partisanship looks like about 7% of African Americans identify as Republicans. That's actually a decline from 2014, 2015, where about 11% of African Americans identified as Republicans. So I'll keep that up for a couple of seconds. Now, as the extensive scholarship on civil rights and black politics makes clear, African Americans made critical and significant advances for racial equality by way of the New Deal and the Great Society programs, thereby anchoring African Americans in democratic liberalism. Now, the second very basic truth is that the GOP of today bears little resemblance to the party of Lincoln, to which black voters had been fiercely loyal since the era of Reconstruction. Instead, the modern Republican Party is associated with Herbert Hoover's Lily White movement, Operation Dixie of the 1950s, Richard Nixon's suburban strategy and Southern strategy. It is a party whose 1964 presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, voted against the landmark Civil Rights Act passed in that year, and whose 1980 nominee launched his official presidential campaign with the now infamous states' rights speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And by the way, there's a really interesting story around Ronald Reagan and that Neshoba County Fair speech. If anybody is interested, I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A or during the reception. In short, the modern GOP is a party whose conservatism, to quote political scientists Robert Smith and Haynes Walton, seems to make it virtually impossible for blacks, given their history and their experience, to accept. Now, these two strands of thought, or two basic truths, are mutually reinforcing. They're confirmed through our everyday experiences, individual encounters, media reports, fictional depictions, and television and film, think Carlton Banks from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and scholarly studies all appear to work in concert to produce a pervasive vision of the past century that leaves little room for the coexistence of racial minorities, conservatism, and the Republican Party. All of our instincts, scholarly and otherwise, tell us that African Americans should not be Republicans, nor should they be conservatives. And yet, Black Republicans do exist. Their inevitable existence, of course, complicates all of these assumptions and, frankly, has perplexed historians and political scientists alike. Some Black families never left the Republican field, while other individuals have found their way back to the GOP. The last 3 decades alone have witnessed the rise of a number of prominent African-American members of the Republican Party. Just this past year, we've seen Ben Carson, right? But we also know there's Clarence Thomas, Colin Powell, J.C. Watts, Condoleezza Rice, Michael Steele, Herman Cain, Mia Love, Tim Scott. These are just a few. But rather than erasing our public curiosity, the appearance of Black Republicans merely intensifies it, often infusing a new sense of urgency into the underlying question of why. Now, I find all of these perspectives of Black Republicans deeply unsatisfying. They tell us little about who Black Republicans are, why they joined the GOP, what they really believe, and why. They also tell us little about the Republican Party more generally. So essentially, our assumptions about African Americans in the GOP are teleological and ahistorical. Or in other words, they're informed by the Republican Party as it exists in the present, right now in the present moment. Our implicit views of Black Republicans, either as strange alien creatures or as noble exceptions among their duped Democratic brethren, reject the notion of political choice. In other words, Black Republicans are both invisible and hypervisible, isolated political misfits who often provoke extreme reactions on the left and the right. Now, my book offers a new understanding of the interactions between African Americans and the Republican Party and provides insights into the seemingly incongruous intersection of civil rights and American conservatism. My work uncovers a movement of African Americans working for an alternative economic and political civil rights movement, and it illustrates that Black Republicans occupy this pretty weird, irreconcilable position in that they were simultaneously shunned by African American communities and subordinated by the Republican Party. In response, Black Republicans vocally and at times viciously critique members of their race and their party, attempting to regulate and influence the attitudes, behaviors, and public images of both Black citizens in the GOP. Now, my study is national in emphasis. I'm just going to move forward a little bit. This is just a little bit of background for those of you who are interested in the literature. This is the background on what people argue about and that my work pushes back against. Now, my study is national in emphasis, but also focuses on Black involvement in the Republican Party and its state and local level politics. The most crucial figures in this narrative were a relatively small group of Black men and women. And just want to show you up here, this is the table of contents from my book. You can kind of see the chapter outlines. The group here are a group of Black Republicans who protested, led by Jackie Robinson, the baseball icon, at the 1964 Republican National Convention. Keep in mind that between 1936 and 1960, between 23 to 40% of African Americans identified as Republican. Between 1964 and present day, that figure has ranged between a low of 4% and a high of about 17%. Nevertheless, this small group of activists, politicians, leaders, officials, and occasionally intellectuals helped steer the maneuverings of the GOP, the modern GOP. Now, there's a tremendous amount of work on Black political thought, action, and policy, and I'm actually not going to take you through that because I don't have enough time. But suffice to say, most of the scholarship has, and most of the scholarship has focused on the left, and that's because most of the actual action in terms of progress happens on the left during the 1960s. Now, more recently, a rapidly growing body of literature has started to push back against that. But my work is different. because it focuses on the intersections of race, civil rights, and conservatism and party politics, and really addresses the nuts and bolts of Black Republican activism and the ideas that motivated these actions. It also focuses on the middle period of 1936 to 1980, of which there is very, very little scholarship, although there is an abundance of primary source research. Now, I revised the broader account by pointing to a long history of Black Republican activists, a cadre of figures who were middle-class professionals, right, who hailed primarily from California, Michigan, New York, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. They were mostly men, at least until the 1960s, when Black women, despite being the least likely of any racial demographic to vote for the Republican Party, increasingly played an important public role in party affairs. And we might think about how Black women today, this fact holds true, they were the least likely of any group to support Republicans, but how in some ways they have also become figureheads. And we might think about, say, for example, Donald Trump's campaign, where he currently, throughout the campaign season, had at any given time 5 Black women as the face of his campaign, and what that might mean. So they increasingly play an important public role in party affairs. Many were members of local chapters of civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the National Urban League, or the Congress of Racial Equality. And yet at the same time, many Black Republicans often distanced themselves from the direct action and civil disobedience protests that characterized the classical civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and publicly repudiated the Black power cries that exploded in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize, and I'm just going to go ahead here and say, I'm not necessarily going to go through this, but I do want to point this out. I divide the Black Republicans' action into 3 different areas, 3 different very important areas. One thing I want to mention is that Black Republicans saw 2-party competition and conservatism as legitimate solutions that should be considered seriously in the struggle for racial equality. Thus, African Americans attempted to influence the direction of conservatism, not to destroy it, but rather to expand the boundaries of the ideology in order to include Black needs and interests. This is what I call a flexible interpretation of conservatism. It was elastic by definition and necessity, since issues of race, representation, and power guided Black Republican actions. So what I'd like to do now, I'm pointing out these kind of 3 waves, put up here 3 waves of Black Republican activity. I'd like to turn my attention to the 3rd wave of the 1970s and share with you a little sliver of some of my research. This is really a moment of chaos and confusion, a point where the potential for party reform suffered tremendous setbacks. And I want to talk about, I want to talk about this moment where there was this real potential for reform, but the shortcomings of the party on race in particular ends up cutting out or cutting short this idea of reform, and broadening the idea of broadening the party tent. So with that, I'd like to turn back to this example that I started out with of William Coleman and Gerald Ford. I have a picture up here. This is the day Bill Coleman is sworn in as Secretary of Transportation with his friend Thurgood Marshall doing the swearing in. So Coleman is widely known and respected for his civil rights work as president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and one of the legal advisors on Brown v. Board of Education. He's also a Black Republican. The joy surrounding his appointment came with the understanding of the gravitas of an African American assuming such a position of influence as the leader of transportation. He was responsible for overseeing one of the largest federal departments, managing a budget of more than $12 million and directing a staff of over 100,000. Coleman's appointment still presented a first of sorts, at least for the modern-day GOP. Not only was the Philadelphia lawyer the first African American to be appointed to a cabinet position by a Republican, Coleman was also the first Black Republican to accept such a prominent role. Now, he's active in local and national party affairs for 3 decades, but the importance, what I want us to focus on this next level, is really that his presence illustrated the possibility of reconciling racial and political loyalties and still being a national success. What's more, Coleman, along with Edward Brooke, who I mentioned earlier, really embodies the policy-making potential of Black Republican politics in the 1970s, beyond the state and local level where most Black Republicans continued to struggle. For African American members of the GOP, this appointment was of tremendous consequence. It held dual meaning. Not only did it mean addressing civil rights and African American issues with the full force of the federal government, and I should mention that Coleman really sees the Department of Transportation as a civil rights project, a way to help racial minorities and the poor, particularly around issues of mobility. But it also signifies the integration of Black Republican voices into the upper echelons of the GOP. Now, the problem here, though, is that as Black Republicans cheer the success of one of their own, they're also despairing over their unchanging status within the party. By 1975, in spite of a united front presented by Black Republican groups, African Americans had not experienced a substantial increase in their ability to affect change within the GOP. Nor had they witnessed any meaningful expansion in the number of Black elected officials or policy-making appointments. Despite Gerald Ford's open-door policy, Coleman's appointment was only one of a few made by the administration. Now, I'm not saying that Gerald Ford is, this kind of draconian president in the way that we might imagine Richard Nixon to be, somebody like that. But certainly, certainly Gerald Ford's commitment to inclusivity was more pronounced than Richard Nixon in both language and behavior. Just to give you a few examples, in his first 8 months in office, the accidental president met with more Black leaders and groups than any previous White House resident of either political party. He was a regular speaker and fixture on African American civic, religious, and political events. And I can't stress this enough. There used to be a running joke that he would show up at Black churches and testify. And he was also really lauded for his outspoken support for a 5-year extension of the Voting Rights Act. It really earns him supporters from both political parties. The problem, however, is that even as African Americans are really optimistic going into the early days of the Ford administration, within months, the contradictory and divisive actions of the GOP at large, coupled with the lumbering behaviors of the White House and many missteps, would ultimately render Ford's platitudes of inclusion untrustworthy. Now, as the 1970s progressed, Black Republicans could claim clear victories in their march towards equality. So they look, for example, the expansion of a number of umbrella groups like the National Black Republican Council, which I'll refer to as the NBRC, the incorporation of African Americans into positions at within the RNC hierarchy, Black Republicans integrating state and local hierarchies, party hierarchies, and then individual examples of success like Ed Brooke or Bill Coleman. But they also quickly realized that quite a bit of that lacked in actual substance, right? Because they're actually not reforming the party as a whole. In fact, on matters of race, the party is moving, by the mid-1970s, is moving even further to the right. They realized this crisis, Black Republicans realized this crisis as their fortunes rapidly declined, and ultimately what they end up doing is fighting very viciously amongst themselves and making concessions about Black outreach in order to maintain a semblance of influence and power within the GOP. Now, for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on a few key moments because I think they showcase the chaos of a shifting GOP, but also the potential of the party. So remember I said that point about paying particular attention to the different paths the party could have taken. The first one that I want to point to is this moment where we have Coleman desegregating the Republican cabinet in 1975. Black people within the party and GOP reformers are also pushing for two critical policy changes. The first one is to give African Americans and other auxiliary members of the RNC an actual vote, meaning that they can vote on policy and things like that. The second, which is the more important of the two, is an initiative that would have instituted a state-by-state positive action program, which would have required state parties to submit inclusion plans documenting their efforts to coax underrepresented groups into the Republican Party. Another way to look at this, just to stress the kind of radical nature of this, is it would have dramatically reshaped the face of the Republican Party, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Right? Because it would have required Republicans to make a good faith effort to diversify the party at every single level. Now, this is, again, pretty revolutionary within the context of the GOP, since the party had really long struggled with many of these ideas. John Wilkes, who's a black Republican, actually argues that the party has to do this in order to reckon with the realities and the changing demographics of the nation. Quote, moving into 1976, he warned, the party will have to take a cold, pragmatic view towards the inclusion of blacks and other special interest groups in all party business. So for those of you who might be familiar with Republican politics, you might think about the 2013 autopsy report, or the Growth and Opportunity Report, which essentially said the same thing, right? Because of changing demographic trends, that eventually, at least by 2030, 2040, that the party would have to win some percentage, some sizable percentage of the minority vote. Now, this is something that Gerald Ford argues that is incredibly important. I just want to share a quote from him. He says, "We must discard the exclusiveness that has kept the Republican Party's doors closed too often while we give speeches about keeping it open." The problem with this is that a lot of this is rhetoric. And so as Republican reformers put forward these ideas, we have another wing of the party that really attacks these reforms as a ploy to pad the ranks of the GOP with liberal subversives. The accusations highlighted conservative Republicans' fears over what they called racial and ethnic minorities, women, and youth, what they represented, or what they believed they represented. Positive action programs, one critic argued, constituted a violation of states' rights. It was a monitoring program that contained the, quote, seeds of mischief and an immoral and perilous quota system, the likes of which had destroyed the Democratic Party. Ronald Reagan stuck the final dagger in the heart of the positive action programs in 1975, arguing that broadening the GOP base via targeting outreach was akin to rejecting conservative principles. Quote, "No one can quarrel with the idea that a political party hopes it can attract a wide following," he argued, "but does it do this by forsaking its basic beliefs? By blurring its image so as to be indistinguishable from the opposing party? I think not." The conservative journal Human Events put it another way, calling positive action programs a spectacle of gravitating towards the quota mindset. Such references lend credence to the notion that conservative Republicans wanted a party where there was, quote, little room for the poor, the blacks, or the common man. The assumption was that the groups targeted by the initiatives would weaken and ultimately destroy the GOP rather than strengthen the party. And it really ignored the fact that those attracted to the GOP in the first place, even amongst underrepresented groups, tended to be conservative. The notion that renegade African Americans would join the establishment GOP to destroy it from within, it was specious at best. Now, positive action programs die a slow death, but more importantly, or equally important, they turn the concept of inclusion into a public relations platitude designed to make the nation say, hey, Republicans are people too. And just so you know, this is actually the name of a campaign that is launched in 1975, right? It's also a name of a campaign that is launched in 2014 that doesn't do too well, as you can imagine. Now, there are countless other examples of this, and I'm happy to discuss a few more of the policy examples during the Q&A. But what I really want to stress here is that the problem is not necessarily, say, a Ronald Reagan or critics of this, but instead what Black Republicans identify as the problem is how Ford, as the leader of the party, spoke of inclusion and expansion, but didn't actually put any effort into institutionalizing that inclusion and expansion. Right? So there are a number of other issues that arise. For example, busing becomes a real sour point, not just between African Americans in the Ford administration, but particularly between Black Republicans in the Ford administration. A number of Black Republicans become very frustrated with their ability to influence President Ford on Black-related issues. Now, there are a number of areas where this plays out, but I'm most interested in Gerald Ford's 1976 presidential campaign, not only because current political campaign politics, but also because at the moment that it's happening, it has real and tangible implications for his success and his ability to win in the 1976 presidential election. It also later on has implication for how the party restructures itself in the late 1970s and 1980s. Now, in the months gearing up for the presidential election, Black Republicans harshly denounced the president. So this is the same person that they had kind of really opened and been excited about. Within a couple of months, they're angrily kind of speaking out against the president. And their frustrations conveyed this feeling about the administration's inconsistent approach to Black issues and outreach, not necessarily to the president's re-election desires. So this wasn't necessarily about them opposing Gerald Ford becoming president. No, many of them campaigned for him and wanted him to be president. They were very angry about their ability to influence him and what the administration and later what his campaign decided to focus on. Negotiations ultimately led to the development of the Black Citizens Program in December 1975. A voluntary initiative, limited in scope, the outreach program relied on the local campaign efforts of Black Republican leaders, who in turn served as advisors on issues pertinent to the Black community. Now, the White House also viewed Black Republicans' organizational networks as an added boost, believing, as one white official explained in a confidential memo, that these Black Republican organizations would ensure that Ford had, quote, good Blacks on his side during the president's anticipated bitter primary battle with Ronald Reagan. Now, but with a staff of 2 unpaid Black Republicans, a restricted 9-month budget of $60,000, and an emphasis on public relations displays instead of actual meaningful ideas, the Black Citizens Program was limited in impact at best. Now, although it secured financial and moral support from prominent Black Party members like Bill Coleman, the outreach initiatives nevertheless struggled to become viable. Now, in spite of these frustrations with the party, rank-and-file Black Party members really poured their efforts into the Black outreach program. They swamped the campaign with suggestions on Black outreach, sending thousands of letters. One person, for example, John Keenan of Washington, D.C., even sent sample speeches for Gerald Ford use, drawing heavily on the words and concerns of moderate Black Republicans. They proposed that Ford speak to Black churches, Black businesses, neighborhood groups, fraternal councils, youth organizations, barbershops, and labor unions. They urged the president's campaign to stress family values. They also argued that they should go after Black women aggressively, erroneously believing that they would come out in front, that Black women would come out in front as Republicans before Black men. So even then, there's an understanding of the importance of Black women as kind of this, as this voting base. Now, the president's campaign actually ignores most of these suggestions. It consistently fumbles Black outreach despite a steady stream of interest from African American constituents. And now, this is one of the things I really do want to emphasize. There's I think, a common perception that African Americans simply aren't interested in Republican politics. What the documents here at the Ford administration actually show is that there is a tremendous amount of interest, a surprising amount from surprising individuals, including leaders in civil rights organizations, leaders in religious groups, leaders in fraternal organizations, and things like that. The problem, however, is that, as one dejected Black GOP official wrote, that neglect, right, had the effect of turning off Black voters. Now, in Michigan, the official noted his efforts were met with mixed success. After one session, for example, a Black businessman rented several vans, decorated them for Ford, and took groups of mini-skirted Black women and music into Black neighborhoods to pass out literature to generate support. So this is their idea of Black outreach. Far more common was the indifferent Black officials, the indifference encountered by Black officials who spoke to African Americans, who said that they were interested in the Republican Party, and particularly in Gerald Ford, but felt like they were being ignored by the White House. Now, the fascinating part to me in all of this is that the GOP still wants Black support. And you can find dozens and dozens of memos where they talk about how they want to win black voters. But you can also find dozens and dozens of memos where they talk about how they want to do it without exerting meaningful effort or without having to actually enact significant policy changes. Now, Nathan Wright, a black Republican who is involved with the Ford administration, remarks in a 1976 piece that the party would never concede influence voluntarily or change overnight. The sad fact has been, he mused, that the Republican Party, quote, for nearly several generations now, has been largely more shadow than substance. And perhaps the most shocking twist in all of this, several black Republicans end up endorsing California Governor Ronald Reagan for president. At the time, this was less about support for Ronald Reagan and more about strategic measures or balance of power. It was a warning of sorts, a political threat to compel the president to listen to black Republicans lest they cast their lot with his aggressive and unyielding primary opponent. The other point that I want to note is that the despair, this kind of chaos and despair amongst black Republicans, often resulted in physical chaos as well. A 1976 strategy session made headlines not for its power-grabbing unity strategies, but rather for the knockdown, drag-out fights that peppered the political sessions. Writers for the black outlets Jet and Ebony were scandalized by shouting matches and fistfights, which suggested a level of deeply ingrained unhappiness inside of these Republican camps. This also plays out at the 76 Republican National Convention, wherein black Republicans, because the majority of them are uncommitted delegates, actually have a rare opportunity to act as a balance of power and affect genuine change within the Republican agenda. So say, for example, by withholding their votes, right, or bartering, and adding more protections for minority business, for healthcare, eliminating anti-busing proposals, et cetera, within the Republican platform. So a photo up here of a particularly intense session with President Ford that did not go very well. Both Ford and Reagan were aware of the power of the black delegates and the understanding that actually a specific number of black delegates could actually swing the decision to either candidate. This actually results in pretty interesting campaigning on the part of Ronald Reagan, where he goes and he, weeks before the convention begins, calling up the black delegates and saying, I will do anything that you want me to do on matters of civil rights. I'll actually listen to you. Right? And then at one point, he promises in a session with the black reps that he will uphold civil rights programs even at the point of a bayonet. Right? Now, Ford, by far, is seen as the far more moderate and racially liberal of the two candidates. But there are a number of black Republicans and black delegates in this sense who are very, very angry about what they call the muzzling policy and the benign neglect of the Ford administration. They accuse, in this session here, it gets a little out of hand because they accuse the president of trying to placate them with platitudes, with empty and meaningless platitudes, and for the president taking their vote for granted. They contemplated trying to force Ford's hand by walking out of the convention, disappearing during roll call, engaging in fights on the convention floor, filing lawsuits, anything to cause chaos to the voting process and make black votes matter in the Republican convention. But the reality is that most of the delegates were paralyzed by their fear. Should Ford get the presidential nomination without their assistance, for instance, black Republicans feared that the president would dismiss their concerns altogether. Who needs you, right? A Reagan nomination, on the other hand, might bring concessions, but would place the GOP in the hands of, this is a direct quote, in the hands of crazies from the extremist wing of the party. Thus, a meaningful mutiny amongst African Americans in 1976 have never actually happened. Black delegates largely resigned themselves to voting for Gerald Ford, despite his inconsistencies. As one weary delegate explained, President Ford is the least of the two evils. To add insult to injury, the policy concessions that Black Republicans had fought for and had lobbied for, more robust support for minority enterprise programs, support for certain provisions of affirmative action, that anti-busing, that support for rejection of the anti-busing plank, all of them were ignored. So they actually walk away with nothing. I think one of the things that I want you guys to walk away from as I wrap up this lecture is that this ultimately kicks off a really desperate turn amongst Black Republicans. We see an uptick in the language of inclusion, but a downward trend for policy and actions that are actually inclusive. We also see a number of lawsuits thrown around by Black members of the GOP. For example, a group of Black Republicans actually end up suing the Republican National Committee for violating their 14th Amendment rights. Now, in this case, the uptick in vicious infighting emerges precisely because Black Republicans understood that they were failing to achieve their policy and political objectives. We also see Black campaign officials within the Ford administration essentially give up on the Black vote. Publicly, they'll claim that they'll win 20 to 50% of the Black vote, and I will tell you now that in an alternative reality, I'm being quite serious here, I think it would have been very possible for Gerald Ford to win between 20 to 25% of the Black vote in 1976. But privately, those same Black Republican officials argue that their focus should be on depressing Black turnout and neutralizing the Black vote without appealing to racism. The Black outreach arm of the Ford campaign ended up being a disaster. Slapdash publicity affairs, little financial support, a refusal to make race a part and appeals to Black voters explicit part of the campaign, and the encouragement of colorblind appeals, which Black voters then interpret as neglect. So, and I have a picture here of happier times of Black Republicans with the President Ford campaign staff. And including, I believe it is the man next to the woman in glasses who's one of the people who ends up launching the lawsuit against the RNC. Now, what ultimately ends up happening, we see, this is not just at a national level, on a state-by-state level, we see Black volunteers actually rejected by white campaign workers because the assumption there is that Black voters are only seeking payment and would eventually move on to different political pastures simply because they were Black. I'm not exaggerating here. There are a number of different complaints that are lodged during the 1976 campaign by Black volunteers who are really turned off by their treatment at a state level. So while Gerald Ford has no kind of direct connection to this, it ends up reflecting on him because of this kind of state-by-state treatment. The ultimate strategy ends up being, and this is a direct quote, doing nothing to increase Jimmy Carter's Black vote support in the hopes of harnessing Black apathy. Now, in the 1976 election, Black voters end up rejecting Gerald Ford. Only 8% of the Black electorate end up supporting Ford, and I'll mention that this number is controversial. This is the number that is provided by the Ford campaign up until about the mid-1990s, when all of a sudden outside polling indicators switch it to about 10%, and then they switch it to 15%. I'm happy to talk about the kind of wonkiness of that. But at the time, and I think this is important because it influences future campaign directions, the Ford campaign believes that they only win 8% of the Black vote. In exit polling, Black voters explicitly said that while they were suspicious of Jimmy Carter, the Southern Democrat, they were very angry about the Republican Party's perceived indifference to civil rights and Black issues, particularly around economics and busing. One Black Republican insisted that neither an ideological campaign nor a colorblind effort focused on middle-class and wealthy white suburbanites would win elections. But perhaps best articulating Black Republicans' anger and despondency in the aftermath of the '76 contest was a Black official's note that called the campaign efforts, quote, a traditional white-oriented campaign with virtually no minority or female input in the phantom decision-making process that downplayed its relationship with black voters out of fear that overt actions or appeals by President Ford would stop the trend of Southern white rednecks and right-wingers who were allegedly coming at the Ford bandwagon in sufficient numbers, which would justify our continuing the exclusionary type campaign we were raging. As you can tell, he was pretty angry. The interesting thing here, one of the takeaways, is that we actually see President Ford in subsequent kind of follow-ups and conversations say, you know what, I think they're right. And arguing, from his own accounts, that had he done a little bit more campaigning and gone to a few more churches and actually gone into kind of these barbershops in black neighborhoods, that he actually would have won the election. Later, kind of an assessment, and the assessment that I do in my book actually shows that a slight increase in the states of Ohio and I believe in the states of Mississippi of about 5% would have given Gerald Ford the election. So these are things that they are weighing and that they're seriously thinking about. Now the takeaways, what do I want you to think about moving into the Q&A, but just in general too? I think we can see this period looks at the frustration with rhetoric, with indifference, with the ideas of outreach, and this notion of color blindness as a solution to Republicans' problems. The other point is that the Ford administration does some very real and very important things on matters of race. Particularly through, I mentioned Bill Coleman, the Atlanta airport, which I'm sure everybody has been to, the Atlanta airport, actually comes about because of an initiative with Bill Coleman and the work that he does there. But also I've mentioned earlier too some of the policies and tactics that Ford tackles very well. But a lot of those things become erased or become invisible because of the administration's later commitment or reluctance to really engage African Americans in a substantive way. Now, the last point that I want to make is that we really need to look at the potential that was there. There was interest there on both sides. Right? There was potential there. It exposes, this narrative really exposes what realistically could have been done, what the GOP, the Republican Party, could have looked like had it taken a slightly different approach. And again, after his defeat, President Ford actually says in several conversations that this is in fact something that the party needs to consider seriously. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you guys very much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I think I did something.
Hello.
Hi.
Could you comment on civil rights in the 1960s and civil rights of present
Sorry,
day?
can you speak up a bit?
Civil rights of the 1960s
Yes.
and civil rights of the 2016. Are we the same nation?
Well, Gallup just came out with a really depressing poll that shows that we're perhaps in the most racially polarized moment since the 1960s. So the suggestion there is that perhaps we are the same nation. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there is tremendous importance in the notion that we as a nation did elect a black man to be president. And it's something that was actually bandied about in the 1960s. Ed Brooke, a number of times, almost ended up being Richard Nixon's vice president in 1968. He makes Gerald Ford's short list in 75 and 76. So there are real possibilities there, but it never actually materializes. So I want to say that we are, I want to be optimistic and say that we are a different nation, but I do think that I do have very deep reservations about where we are right now.
Thank you for your talk. I have a couple of questions. The first, I noticed when you had one of your slides up that in 1944, about 40% of African Americans voted Republican, and then it dropped to 25% in 48, and then I believe it was around 15% or so by 1952. What caused that precipitous drop? That's my first question.
Okay, so this is actually black partisan identification, and the vote is slightly different. Happy to talk about that as well. What just happened? Okay, so the interesting thing is that 44 and 48, it's actually 48 that's a really important year. 48 is the year, a couple of different things happen. Truman desegregates the armed forces. He releases to secure these rights, right, on the civil rights. The Democratic Party incorporates a civil rights, a pretty aggressive civil rights plank into its platform at the convention. And Southern Democrats break off and form their own, third-party movement. So it actually allows leeway for black voters not just to vote Democratic, right, but also to identify as Democrats and move away from the Republican Party. So I actually in the book argue that there are several watershed years, that 36 is a watershed year in terms of the black vote switching in presidential elections, but then 248 is another watershed year. And then 1964 is the moment of transformation from which the Republican Party has never been able to recover.
And the second part of the question is, what makes African Americans so monolithic, where there's not that much divisiveness? I know you've been talking about that, but they all vote, as you're saying, in a pack, particularly now. And even though Ford was doing things that would be considered supportive, they turned against him, even though it may have been other Republicans. I didn't care for Jeb Bush when I lived in Florida, but I voted for Lawton Chiles, even though I normally would vote Republican.
So you do actually see a tremendous amount of, I won't use the word tremendous, but you do see ticket splitting amongst African Americans, right? So if we actually look at, if I were to take, say, Senate and Congress and say, overlay that on presidential voting, there's several areas where it might look radically different. Some years it doesn't look too different. Some years it looks really different, right? Even through the present day. So we do see that on a state level, and part of the reason why is because the Republicans who are able to do the best amongst African Americans are Republicans, one, who are able to divorce themselves from a national identity of the Republican Party, right? So I am an Ohio Republican, I stand for this, et cetera, et cetera. But then also, too, African American voters will support Republicans who are strong on civil rights issues. This is consistent. It's, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies has been tracking this since 1971. There's also a black Republican consulting firm in the late 1970s, Wright McNeil and Associates, who go out and consult for Republicans on a state and local level and find that if they switch their message to a positive pro-civil rights message, they can actually increase their support amongst black voters by 30 percentage points. So literally Wright McNeil breaks it down and they're like, it's really simple. The problem that they run into is that all too often, there are people who are really navigating who say, well, if I do this kind of outreach, if I switch the language that I'm talking about civil rights, won't this mean that I'll lose this other group as well? Now I want to weigh them. I'm going to do a really interesting calculation to see which group I should go after. This has been the Republican Party's problem since 1936. Ralph Bunche, the Nobel Prize winner, the diplomat, the Howard University professor who writes a report for the Republican Party in 1940, says you cannot hunt with both hare and hound. Right? And he says, and he's talking at the time, he says to the Republican Party, you can't go after black voters and go after Southern Democrats at the same time and Southern segregationists. You're going to lose one or the other. Now here, and I think this is one of the things that was really revealing about the Republican Party, particularly under the Ford administration, is that in lots of private conversations, Gerald Ford understands this. But he makes a very cynical calculation at different points in time that his support or his popularity amongst African American audiences will insulate him from this kind of, this kind of support or this appeals to areas that are deeply divisive and are deeply alienating to African American voters. The other thing, one last point to bring up is that there are certain issues that his campaign's people tell him, Robert Keyes in particular, Martin Dinkins, who run the Black Desk, they say are hot button issues. The big one is busing. And so there's a moment where they say, Democrats aren't great on busing either. And they say, you could really work this so that you pull in black voters, but you can't support something like a constitutional amendment banning busing, right? Banning funding for busing. Because even black voters who are opposed to busing see that as discriminatory, right? See that as attack on their civil rights. And so as long as black voters believe that their civil rights are being attacked, that a candidate maybe is not racist or maybe is not bigoted, but traffics in racism and bigotry, they will not support that candidate. So ultimately, I think what ends up happening is Ford really banks on this idea that, he's got this record of doing, some really good things, but doesn't take into account just how devastating these other not so good things are in terms of support.
Yes, I wonder if you could tell, what do you think is the current status of a couple of divisions within black Republicans that you brought out in your book? First of all, the class distinctions and how that led to some different points of view. And then also, you say in the conclusion something unique to the post-1980 period, the hardening of ideological divisions between liberal, moderate, conservative, and now neoconservative African American members of the GOP. Are those still as strong, stronger? What's the current status in regard to ideology and class divisions within black Republicans, please?
Okay. So the interesting thing, I think, with black Republicans is that there's not necessarily any defining characteristic that we see that surrounds, the demographics of who is a black Republican voter. So, the idea for a long time, Republican strategists believed that the wealthier African Americans were, the more likely they were to vote Republican. It's actually the reverse, right? So the wealthier, unless you're in the top 1%, but the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Democratic, right? So it's the opposite. In recent years, we've seen some spread where there indicates that the concept of linked fate, or this idea that African American political decisions are shaped by experience and what one person does affects the other, is loosening. But what ultimately ends up happening, and actually we see this loosen in the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, that's when black Republicans hit their highest affiliation, around 2000, between 2000 and 2004. Much of this is undone when there are moments of intense racialized crisis. So all of that work where we see a number of African Americans who are affiliating as Republicans is undone in the face of Hurricane Katrina, where overwhelmingly black voters and African Americans, regardless of their ideological orientation, blame Republicans, right, and see that as Republicans abandoning African Americans. Right? Now, the interesting thing, though, there is that those divisions that I talk about, these hard ideological lines, really do separate, still do separate African Americans within the Republican Party, even to this day. One of the interesting things that came out earlier this year is that black Republicans were incredibly divided over the candidacy of Donald Trump. About 2/3 of them rejected him, early on in the campaign and said, we can't support somebody like this. And if polling is any indication, a number of them either did not vote in this election, or may have crossed over to third party, or even voted for Hillary Clinton. But we do see these, I think, ideological orientations. And while I think a number of people would assume that it's a religion that divides them, or class, or something like that, that's actually not the case. The two areas that are most important are you a colorblind Black Republican, so do you believe in colorblind initiatives and colorblind policies, or are you a race-conscious Black Republican? So essentially the difference between, say, Clarence Thomas and Colin Powell. The other thing that has a slight, I don't know what what you would call the factor, but is gender, which is that Black men are slightly more likely to, or Black Republicans are slightly more likely to be Black men. So, yeah.
Since there's nobody in line behind me, I'll ask a second question also. And that is, I was really fascinated by your discussion of Edward Brooke in the book, and the criticism of him from other African Americans, which I'll summarize as you did, Uncle Tom. I mean, you say a whole lot more when he was running for Attorney General, the criticism of him campaigning for Nixon. If you could expand just a little bit, I didn't, what was his response to that? You mentioned that he softened his rhetoric, I remember that phrase. Mm-hmm. But, did he get upset? Did he get angry? I know he was trying to be low-key, at least that's my impression. So how did he respond to this criticism from his fellow African Americans?
By the time Brooke leaves Congress, he's actually become much more liberal than when he enters Congress. And it's actually pretty interesting because his constituents, who are largely white in Massachusetts, don't necessarily share the same policy views as him, or even the kind of, especially on racial issues. And they still support him, right? So he has consistently high marks, wherein the constituents who differ with him on his policy prescriptions find ways to justify them because they like him and because they trust him. And so one of the reasons that he actually ends up losing in his mid-1970s bid is because the population actually loses trust in him, right? So he goes from being seen as a politician with integrity to a politician with no integrity because of his divorce scandal, because his daughter leaks documents to the press about him, misappropriation of funds, and things like that. Now, Brooke is really interesting to me, and one of the things that we see when he begins to be called all of these names and et cetera, is that he actually begins to address it head on in some respects. There's this famous incident where he meets with H. Rap Brown, right, from SNCC and Black Panther Party, and his staff is like, "Oh no, don't do it!" Like, why are you going to go meet with this black radical, like in the middle of the night in a safe house? And he says, "Oh, why not? Let's talk." And they sit down, and H. Rep. Brown says, "You're a sellout, and you're working with the establishment. You're the system. You're the man." And Brooke said, and for anybody who's interested, you can see part of the interview in the documentary, The History Makers, his History Makers interview. And he says, "I have power. What I represent is black power." Right? So he redefines the term black power to fit his model of leadership. And he says two things. He says, "My political power is black power because I can shape, right, the Senate. I can shape laws. I can shape policy." And then he also says green power is black power, right? So this idea of black capitalism and economic uplift. So they have this, I think he says they talk for several hours and they agree to disagree. But I think this is the kind of interaction that really marks Brooke. So by the time he leaves the Senate, right? When he's running for his mid-1970s reelection campaign, he has all of these people come out to support him. Coretta Scott King, Jesse Jackson, Gloria Steinem. I mean, this whole host of Motley Crue, Kissinger, all of these people that really, you wouldn't see together, but they're really united by their respect of this person and the force that he represents in Congress.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I have a couple things kind of related. 8% was the latest percentage of the black vote for President-elect Donald Trump. I'm getting used to the phrase. And a month earlier, the polling, and I don't know what we should think about polling, was at 2%. So your thoughts about that, and you also mentioned earlier about polling numbers change in time. Maybe you can kind of elaborate on that a little bit. Also, in the last month of the campaign, it seemed President-elect Trump did seem to reach out to the black voters, and there was a famous visit to Detroit to our Reverend Jackson in a Baptist church, and it makes me wonder if he will be invited to the White House, and we'll wait and see. But the two things that I saw, and I want your take on it, was that Trump's approach was economically a rising tide would lift all boats, so the blacks would benefit from an improving economy. And the other part was the what do you have to lose in the neighborhood there, and the violence, and that seemed to be hinge on increased police efforts that Trump would support. So what do you see? I don't have any other take on what Trump's plans or offerings to and maybe if I can throw in a third thing, Ben Carson reportedly turned down an offer for a position. Does that, do you have any ideas about who else Mr. Trump would want to bring into his administration?
So you've given me a whole bunch of questions. So I'll start off, I'll try and hit polling pretty fast. One, I'll start with the inconsistencies with Ford polling. Through really the mid-1980s, polling of African Americans is horrible. It is terrible. It's not consistent for a very long time. Black actually means non-white. So Latinos, Asians, anybody who is not white is lumped into the category of black. So we see wildly fluctuating kind of interpretations. The Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies actually comes out of a moment, in fact, where they say we need to take very seriously, in 1971, we need to take very seriously black data. And it's really a reaction to this post-Voting Rights Act moment where the landscape of black voting changes dramatically. So there's a lot of, I think, inconsistency, and it has really, it's for historians and political scientists, it's incredibly aggravating. What I tend to do is take the campaign's numbers at face value because it actually influences their decisions in subsequent elections, right? So right now, the Roper Center at Cornell, which is a wonderful resource for anybody who's interested, I think has the number, Gerald Ford winning 17% of the black vote in 1976. And it's based on a New York Times exit poll from 1977, I think. The problem with that is that the campaign and the RNC uses the 8% number to actually make an argument that black support is bottoming out, and so that they have to do something dramatic. And this becomes the impetus for them to hire Wright, McNeil, and Associates and bring in this Black consulting group to help them do better and to mobilize, right? So there's a way in which I think it's important to take these campaigns and look at the numbers that they are using because it dictates their strategy. And then we can also, of course, put an asterisk next to it and just say, there's been much debate over this. For some reason, out of all of these years, the Ford administration, that 76 number is the one that has is the most controversial. In terms of polling for Donald Trump, the interesting thing is that his polling numbers, I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times where I mentioned that his polling numbers have been anywhere between 0% to, in reputable polls, 0% to 9% of the Black vote. The thing is that people want to focus on those, oh my gosh, 0%, 1%, 2%. If you actually look back and you look at Mitt Romney right around the same time, Romney is also tracking around 0%, 1%, 2% of the Black vote in 2012 and ends up coming out with 6%. So for those of us, the few of us who look at Black Republican politics, I think there is always an assumption that those 0, those 1%, those 2% were on the low end, and that it wouldn't be shocking if he actually ended up with anywhere between, 4% to about 13, 14% of the Black vote. And I say that because over the last 50 some odd years, that has been, the bottom and then, the ceiling. So this has been the range of what Republicans have done. So in the low end, without doing any effort, right, Republicans have managed to win 4% of the Black vote. Right? Exerting, somewhat of an effort has garnered 14% of the Black vote. So we can kind of see, I think, Trump, and there are some other interesting points about the number that he ends up receiving, but I think that part of it is kind of the shock and awe of this number when realistically that 8% is right about where he should have gotten given the campaign that he ran. So the other question that you asked, was about Black outreach. Now I'll preface this by saying that Donald Trump's campaign, their Black outreach, was modeled after Ronald Reagan's in 1980. Even down to some of these campaign slogans. There's that famous incident where Ronald Reagan goes to the South Bronx and says to a group of Black and Latino, audience of Black and Latinos, what do you have to lose? Right? Why not? Right? Just give me a shot. Right? And the interesting thing is I spent some time in the Reagan presidential archives and in the 1980 campaign papers. There are explicit memos from his team about what those things actually mean. And they're not actually about Black voters at all. This is explicit. Right? They are targeted at white suburban ticket splitters. And so that story I mentioned about the Philadelphia, Mississippi, the Neshoba County Fair, which people they look at that incident and they say, here is proof that Ronald Reagan was a racist and was running this racist states' rights campaign. What a lot of people don't actually talk about, and I should mention that in the campaign files, they do explicitly say that Neshoba County Fair speech was about states' rights, right? But right after that, right, is the South Bronx event, right? So within 2 or 3 days. And then he goes to Chicago, and he gives a speech to the Urban League that ends up with half of the audience on their feet, clapping and pounding. Then he meets with Jesse Jackson. He tours the offices of Ebony Magazine. And he goes and he does this long sit-down interview with Black Enterprise where he says, racism is a real problem in our country. And in fact, African Americans have been treated quite poorly, and we need to do better, right? And he says, you might even think of me as a Black nationalist. I believe in self-determination. Local power is real power. And so what his staff says is, this is great because we can say what we want to one audience and then say something else to another audience. And what we say to that other audience gives us coverage for this one audience, and then also makes us look attractive to these white suburban ticket splitters. Right? So I'm not kind of saying this is a great strategy, like a good strategy, we should all go out and do this, but it's a brilliant strategy in a way, because what explicitly his team wants to do is make conservatism soft and agreeable so that anybody, including non-conservatives, can embrace it. Right? And so one of the things that's important here is that Reagan really learns from his interactions with African Americans over the course of a 20-year period. He has several very nasty encounters, including one in 1966, where an engagement with black Republicans actually ends up with him running out of the room and driving 40 miles back to Simi Valley with tears in his eyes after being accused of being a racist. So he and his team learn from this experience about how to actually strategically campaign, and they explicitly say they're only interested in 13% of the black vote. And they want to pick it up as an addendum, but that they're much more interested in getting those white moderates. So when I tell you that the Trump campaign really modeled their black outreach strategy after this, I'm completely and utterly serious. Right? These were things that were not aimed at black audiences. If they happen to pick up, I think, some people by the wayside, great. But instead, it's really about talking to an audience and I think reassuring them, hey, like, I can't possibly be this bad guy if I'm talking about these people. Right? One of the things that I think Reagan did much more effectively is that he actually went and he spoke to black audiences. One of the things that worked against Donald Trump is that it took him a very long time to actually go in front of black audiences and speak to them. And the particular one that hurt him very badly amongst black audiences is when he went to Jackson, Mississippi, right, which is 88% black, and spoke to an all-white audience. Right? It's very hard to make the argument that you're serious about black outreach when you have that opportunity to do it. And his campaign does adjust in some ways and does the Detroit incident and things like that, but it's not actually a substantive engagement with black outreach. Now, the one interesting thing that I find here is that even the policies that Donald Trump is offering are modeled after Ronald Reagan's policies. So this New Deal, I'm not sure if people are familiar, but right before, a couple of days before the election, Donald Trump launched a New Deal for Black America. It's a 10-point policy plan. And it is almost identical to the same plan that Ronald Reagan launched in 1980 and 1981. And I don't know how that plan may turn out, but I will say that Ronald Reagan did not do too spectacularly with African Americans in 1984, and that many of the programs that he proposed actually don't work in the way that they envisioned them, particularly the free enterprise programs. So, it still remains to be seen. Not necessarily optimistic given the track record there. And then the last point about appointments. In addition to Ben Carson, there have been a few African Americans who have been shortlisted for positions, for cabinet positions in the Trump administration. I would not be surprised if he appointed not only a person of color, a black person, but Nikki Haley, for example, is being touted as a possible appointee. I know Sheriff David Clark has been touted as a possible appointee, but these are not, I think, unlike say a Lois Sullivan who's appointed to the Bush administration or to the first Bush administration, or a Colin Powell who's incredibly popular amongst African American audiences in the second Bush administration. These are not people who inspire a considerable amount of confidence in this respect. Now, one thing I have heard, and it remains to be seen if this is actually true, is that there have been some kind of backroom talks with black CEOs, black civil rights activists, black academics, and black Democrats about possible positions in Trump administrations, not necessarily cabinet administrations, but actual positions within these administrations. And if that were indeed the case, that would very much be within the realm of what Republicans have done in the last 36 years or so. But again, a lot of it is not just the symbolics of it, but the actual meat of policy, right? And in the case of winning over African Americans, it has to be transformative policy that affects their day-to-day life in order to see an actual, real, measurable change in terms of their support of a Republican presidential nominee. Okay, so I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.
And what better farewell gift than a couple of pens with the signature of President Ford, since you've done research here, and isn't it wonderful to see the papers and all of that come to life? So thank you so much, Leah. This has been fabulous. Just as we thought.
Thank you so much.
Before you go, I want to do an alert for our loyal audience, which is starting in January. Our programs will start at 7 p.m. That's in response to popular demand. We do listen to our clientele, so we'll be matching our times that we have at the museum. So 7 o'clock, we have things already on the schedule and more in process. A lot of good things happening. So I think you'll have lots of questions about both her earlier study and also the recent events in our time. So feel free to come and meet our speaker. We have also surveys out in the lobby. So if you have feedback for us about the program or any suggestions, please fill those out. So thanks so much for coming.
Yeah.